Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone joining the webinar today. We are very delighted to have you with us with the first MCR 2030, the Making City Resilient 2030 webinar of the year 2022. The title of today, we will be discussing about the City Resilience Program, or the CRP, that supporting cities in building resilience. We are also having with us here the speakers from the World Bank, who will be giving us the walkthrough of this, about the program. And before we start, I just want to give you a little bit of the housekeeping notes that we do have the interpretation available in French and Spanish, so you can select the language at the globe icon at the bottom, or else the session will be running all in English for today. And additionally, feel free to drop your questions if you have any at the bottom using the Q&A option, and we'll be happy to address to them at the Q&A session of today. And the session will be running for an hour with two parts on the presentation about the City Resilience Program, and then more insights from the engagement with the cities who have been working with the CRP. So without further ado, let me invite Sanjaya Bhatia, Head of the Office for Northeast Asia and Global Education and Training Institute of UNDRR, for the welcome remarks. Over to you, Sanjaya.
Thank you, Mai, and welcome to all the participants. And thanks to the speakers from the World Bank for introducing the CRP, which is kind of a service being offered under the Making Cities Resilient 2030. Most of you might know MCR 2030 is a 10-year initiative with a number of partners, including the World Bank, as a core partner in the governing body of the initiative, aiming to provide, give access to cities to services of various thematic areas, including finance, or how to access finance, climate information, updating building codes, looking at resilient infrastructure, and so on. So it's a platform. We'll put the link in for you. For those who are not aware of it, please have a look at that. And now, without further ado, I'll hand over back to Mai so we can get on with the session. Thank you again, everyone.
Yes, thank you, Sanjaya. So we'll be dedicating the next sessions just to understand about the City Resilience Program. And I would like to invite first the two speakers, Manuela Chiapparino, the Senior Operation Officer of the World Bank, apology for the pronunciation, and also Stephen Rubinyi, Disaster Risk Management Specialist of the World Bank. Both of them are leading different pillars, the strategic pillars of the CRP, and they'll be sharing with us what the CRP is about and what are the services included and provided by the City Resilience Program. So over to you, Manuela and Stephen.
Thanks a lot, Mutarika, and welcome everybody. We're very happy to be here today to present the City Resilient Program. So I'll share my screen and I'll stop the video just to make sure there's no problem with the connection. Okay. Second. Okay. So again, nice meeting you. My name is Manuela Chiapparino. I'm Senior Operation Officer at the World Bank Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, and I co-lead the City Resilient Program with Steve Rubinyi, who's here today, and also Rob Pilkington, who leads the finance pillar of the program. So very briefly, a bit the reasons why CRP was created in 2017. So as many of you know, rapid urbanization over the last century has brought many challenges, exacerbated by changing climate, natural hazards, and other threats. Poorer populations remain the more vulnerable, as often they live in hazard-prone areas and lack of means to recover from shocks. According to a recent report by the Global Infrastructure Outlook website, there will be a $15 trillion infrastructure financing gap by 2040, and global average losses from natural hazard, whether or not related, are estimated to increase by 1/3 by 2030. Cities does need to increase their investment, but often face financing and capacity constraints. Against this, the CRP, the City Resilience Program, was established in 2017 as part of the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery. So a few words about GETI. Is established in 2007. It's a global partnership that helps developing countries better understand and reduce the vulnerability to natural hazards and climate change. GETI is housed at the World Bank, but it's a multi-donor partnership with donors from all over the world. And since its establishment in 2007, it coordinates and collaborates very closely with UNDRR, and the strategic objectives of GETI are fully aligned and support the Sendai framework for action goals. As I said, CRP is part of the GETI. It's one of its flagship programs. Others includes a program on nature-based solution, with whom we work very closely because many of the issues are very much related. A program on fragility, conflicts, and violence and nexus with disaster risk management. A program on hydromet and early warning system, where we also partner very closely with UNDRR under the Cruise initiative. A program on risk financing, and so on. Just a second. Next. Sorry. A few words about the City Resilience Program. Again, as I mentioned, it was established in 2017, thanks to the support of the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, and also from the Austrian Federal Ministry of Finance. CRP aims at increasing financing for urban resilience, while catalyzing a shift toward longer-term, more comprehensive multidisciplinary packages of technical and financial services, building the pipeline for viable projects at the city level that in turn build resilience. The program has 3 strategic pillars: the planning for resilience, led by Stephen, who will talk right after me; the finance for resilience, led by Rob; and the partnership for resilience, which I co-lead with Rob and Stephen, depending on the type of partnership we work on. CRP supports, as of today, more than 130 cities around the world. You can see a quick snapshot of where CRP is active, either through one of the 3 pillars. Few words about the Partnership for Resilience pillar. It's really about leveraging partnership on different areas where we think coordination is important, starting from technical assistance funding, where we partner very closely with other trust funds managed by the World Bank, for example, the Global Infrastructure Facility, the Public-Private Investment Advisory Facility, the GAP Fund, which is the fund that works on adaptation managed by the bank, and the European Investment Bank. We work a lot with other agencies to identify opportunities for co-financing, just naming IFC, of course, International Finance Corporation, ICID, which is the Spanish Agency for Development Cooperation, Agence Française de Développement, and the Dutch private sector arm. We also work with several potential bidders and lenders and investor and industry members under the private sector investment pillar and the financing pillar. And of course, we network also with several private firms for technical services. This is mainly under the planning and finance for resilience pillars that Steve will talk about. Stephen, sorry. And then, of course, we cooperate closely with UNDR and other World Bank community of practice to identify best practice at international level that we can build upon and share with the cities we work with. So I try to be as fast as possible to give the floor to Stephen, who will talk you through the remaining pillars and give also some practical example of how we can work together. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Manuela. So moving forward, as Manuela mentioned, there are 3 pillars to the City Resilience Program. She just covered the first pillar, focused on partnerships. I'll focus on planning and finance. For the planning for resilience pillar, what we want to do is we want to make sure that cities have access. Can you go back a slide, please, Manuela? Thank you. Yeah. For the planning for resilience pillar, we want to focus on helping cities to increase access to tools and technical support to plan effectively for resilience. We do this in several ways. I think the first is really focusing on some of the data gaps that we see out there. So what we do is we try to help teams by focusing on a global level of thinking through different types of data sets that have emerged, a lot of them from satellite data, that can help to identify things like different features within the built environment and start to think about how cities are going to expand and grow, what their vulnerabilities may be, which hazards they may be exposed to. We put a lot of this information into a city scan analysis, which I'll get into a bit later. But the idea for this is to really provide a starting point for cities to have conversations around some of their resilience challenges. I think what we find is that oftentimes cities don't really know where to start, and that's really meant as a bit of an entry point to help engage with city officials from different parts of the administration to really figure out, what are the priorities and the big challenges going forward, a bit beyond that sector by sector viewpoint that I think we can all get a bit too focused on when we're focused on individual projects and investments. We offer workshops as well that bring this all together, where we work with city officials. We bring in different forms of expertise, both from the planning for resilience pillar, but also the other pillars of the program, that can help cities think through in much more detail related to specific projects and investment priorities, how to integrate resilience into those priorities, and how to think through the different financing aspects of those projects. At the next level of detail, we then get into more project-tailored resilience advisory. This is more along the lines of, once you have an investment identified, in any city, there may be, say, 2 or 3 investment priorities that are at the top of the agenda. We can work with you to really think through the spatial implications of resilience. Are you building a road in a place that may be flood prone, for example, or to think through more the asset by asset information? Is it up to standards? Are you thinking about how the hazard profile of the city may change in 2050 for things like urban heat or flooding? And then lastly, what we do is, because we're a global program working at a global level, we try to engage in these framework agreements where we work with some of the best global firms in this space, and we streamline things like defining terms of references, providing quality assurance of deliverables, et cetera. And what this does is it provides a nice link between our teams on the ground and global expertise in a very tangible way that helps them to achieve results. Next slide, please. So the third pillar, the finance for resilience pillar, is really focused on the fact that if we're going to be working with cities on a larger agenda, on integrating resilience into their investment planning, we need to also take a practical understanding that that has implications in terms of the amount of financing and the size of the investment agenda that's needed. So we work as well with cities to ensure that they have increased access to multiple sources of financing to ensure that more investments in resilience can actually come to fruition. So what that means in practice, is we focus on private provision of public services, such as public-private partnerships, land value capture, and different techniques like that as additional sources of funding and ways to deliver infrastructure investments. The way that we do this is sort of a three-stage approach. The first is focused on investment identification. We have rapid assessments that can look at potential investments, the enabling environment, et cetera. And then stage two focuses a bit more on investment preparation. So less on the enabling environment, more on pre-feasibility assessments for land value capture, public-private partnerships. And then stage three is really focused on the investment structuring. So this is where the details of the structure get sorted out, where you actually figure out the viability of a particular project. So we support transaction advisory, terms of reference and delivery, land value capture assessments that can support affordability, and a bit more detail on the enabling environment and capacity is oftentimes once you get into the details of a project, you start to tackle some of those fundamental questions around, is this something that is both supported, by the city administration, but also by, say, the legal framework of the country. In terms of financial instruments, the CRP, we can provide viability gap financing. So this needs to be supporting World Bank lending. So oftentimes there may be a project where there are opportunities to mobilize private financing, but on its own it may not be entirely viable. So are there ways that we can help to mobilize resources to help support the project and make it so it's not entirely public financed? We have a guarantee program that we're getting off the ground. So we're enabling co-guarantees for private investors. This is meant to de-risk some potential projects, which certain cities may need and can improve the terms that one gets offered. And then co-financing. As mentioned, we're a global program. So we want to facilitate access to co-lending to allow for larger operations and donor coordination. This includes, for example, from other IFIs. Next slide, please. So our value add as a program, we see it as sort of three things. One is in project preparation. So specialized project preparation teams on our side can provide advisory in areas on resilience planning, private sector mobilization, and concessional finance. In terms of our network, we have natural linkages with World Bank task teams. Manuela mentioned earlier some of the global programs that GFDR supports. So, for example, if the city is interested not only in this, but also how to integrate nature-based solutions, which we find, for example, has a dual effect of say, urban cooling for cities that experience high levels of heat, but also focus on the broader low carbon agenda. We can connect to other global teams that work on this quite easily. We connect to task teams on the ground. So being centered as a global program, we work across every region at the World Bank, and we can connect to task teams that are working more specifically on cities and countries within the regions, and to city officials. So, through events like this, we hope to hear more from you, and to be able to get some of that interest from the ground up and connect you directly with our teams and with the support that we can offer as part of CRP. And this gets a bit to the convening power of it. So I mentioned the workshops earlier, but what we really try to do is put together certain events for city officials supported by specialist tools and analytics. So we want to make sure that the tools that we're developing can get shared with city officials directly, can support World Bank teams as they engage in dialogue with city officials as well, so that at the end of the day, the projects that are financed can be informed by an understanding of the resilience challenges that the city face, and that options are thoroughly assessed in terms of the different potential means of financing to support those investments. Next slide, please. So there are two products from CRP, two services that are linked right now in the MCR 2030 service directory. So we flagged one from each side of the Planning for Resilience program and Finance for Resilience pillars of the CRP. The first is the city scan, and the second is private capital mobilization advisory. So the services of the CRP aren't necessarily limited to this, but this is, we thought, a good starting point to highlight on the MCR 2030 dashboard. Next slide, please. So the city scan, this is a rapid assessment of the city's critical resilience challenges. It's primarily focused on maps, geospatial analyses, but there's some tabular data in there as well. And what we really try to do is focus on the interaction between the built and natural environment. As of fall 2021, we had created 86 city scans. That number is now over 100. So what we've tried to do is do what we can very quickly and cheaply using open global data sources, and you can get some good information. So if just as an example, you can see in the pictures on the right, the far right is you can see of land surface temperature, and you can see hotspots. So this is an urban hotspot map in Saudi Arabia. This is entirely from free data from Landsat 8. On the left, you can see socioeconomic characteristics. This is from the Relative Wealth Index, which is actually a data set that's provided free of charge by Facebook. It can tell you pockets of relative wealth within a city. Next slide. So for private capital mobilization advisory, I think we just wanted to provide two examples of what this could entail. The first is identifying land value capture. So in Dar es Salaam, for example, we worked on development rights in exchange for private investment to remediate and protect an urban river basin. So this is advisory services on the fact that there's a flood protection investment being made, and inherently when that investment is made, land values around the areas that are protected will go up. So the question fundamentally is, can the city mobilize resources from that public investment as a means to help to finance the overall project? The second is supporting public-private partnerships. Just a quick example of this is in Accra, where we're helping to develop the case for affordable, effective solid waste management. So if either of those interests you, the information is on the MCR site. Next slide, please. And to access our support from CRP, you can see that you can go directly to the MCR 2030 dashboard. We're a core partner of MCR 2030. Or you can send an email to us directly at crpinfo@worldbank.org. So we take emails, requests anytime. It's on a rolling basis. To access our support, contact us. There are two ways. The first is through task teams at the World Bank that are already assigned to your city. So we're aware that the World Bank has a large network already working with many of the cities on this webinar. So if you know your team, get in contact with them and they can get in contact with us, or get in contact with us directly and we can put you in touch with the task team. So key to this is, as a global program, we always work through our task teams. So we're not going to support you directly. We'll get in touch with the task team, and the task team will make that connection. So please get in touch with the task team if you know them. Otherwise, reach out to us and we can do the same and help you make that connection. In terms of timelines for approval, from the time you send us an email, we try to get an initial decision on support within 2 weeks in terms of getting back to you. This will depend again, on the task team once we get in touch with them. But we will do our best to follow up immediately and figure out if this is something that falls within the scope of what we can support. Next slide, please. So what we need from you, it's key to involve us early. So success is really built on the early stages of project identification. Resilience planning requires you to take a step back and think about some of the broader challenges that the city may be facing further upstream. And then to bring those innovations in project design requires a bit of forethought into, for example, how is my city going to develop? What are the hazards that the city's exposed to? How will those change over time due to a changing climate? On the finance side, it's very important to plan ahead if you're interested in the private capital mobilization piece of this. So you need to be able to build in the flexibility into the project to think through opportunities, to focus on, what sort of technical assistance may be needed to flesh out a piece, for example, in viability gap financing, what piece of it could we take out that could potentially, have a private financing element to it. And use our resources and networks. So we're happy to have informal discussions or connect your teams with others across the World Bank Group through your task teams. This is something where, even if you don't have a firm idea yet about how you'd like to use CRP resources or to engage with the World Bank in this, we're happy to have a discussion. We're happy to point you in the right direction. So please do feel free to reach out. Next slide. So that's a quick overview of CRP. Manuela and I are here to answer your questions that you may have. Otherwise, I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen and Manuela. There are a couple of questions, so I think we can address them now before we go to the next speaker, Megha. So, just building up on where you stopped, Steve, how to contact, but is there any preparatory work that the city should do, or any criteria that they need to meet before actually reaching out? So before reaching out, I think we're limited to World Bank countries. So if your country is a member, of the World Bank Group, then we can provide services in those countries. As mentioned, we do want to get cities involved, very far upstream. We want them to reach out if they have any sort of interest in developing a project. The key here as well is that it does need to be linked to World Bank financing. So what we do as a program is we work in parallel with task teams to help supplement some of the technical expertise that is required to put together projects. So the task teams on the ground, they're the ones that are responsible for engaging directly with the cities, thinking through World Bank financing options around supporting a broader resilient cities agenda. And we can provide the technical expertise around that. So, while we would, be happy to engage with cities in sort of, broader dialogue around how we can help them improve their resilience, to truly access the services, there needs to be some viable option for the World Bank to support through, for example, a lending operation. So, most of the countries
that I've seen in the chat, for example, you're very eligible for World Bank financing. World Bank's done quite a bit in many of the countries that are listed, and this is something that we can consider alongside World Bank financing.
Yes, and maybe just to add to what, maybe just to add to what Stephen said, CRP remains a small program. It's like a catalyzer to then link to longer term financing from the World Bank. But my advice would be get in touch with us. And if not through CRP, there may be other programs within the bank or within GETI that could also provide a different type of support, which is more small grants or different types of technical assistance. So don't be shy, reach out, and if there is a way for us to help you, we'll do the best to do so. I saw there was a question from Portugal. Unfortunately, not our program can only finance projects in developing countries, so non-European countries, of course. But again, there are other instruments within the bank, which are, for example, reimbursable advisory services. So again, reach out to us, and we'll try to put you in touch with the right colleagues in the bank, and there may be a solution as well.
Thanks for that clarification, and all the participants may note, as Stephen also mentioned, that there is an email address to reach out, and there is also the MCR 2030 dashboard. There is another just a connected thread about private sector involvement in the CRP program and support from the private sector and how the private sector could benefit. So would you like to elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. So I think the key here is to understand that the private sector is not always an option. It's not a panacea to broader financing challenges. What we want to make sure is that it's not being ruled out prematurely. I think a lot of us come from more of a public finance background. We're thinking about the budgets that are available to us, the financing that are available to us. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that, if we're going to think through a broader resilience agenda, the financing needs that a city may face, they're going to be large. They're going to be larger than what the World Bank can finance on its own. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're presenting not only potential resilient solutions around a broader agenda, but also, financing options for that agenda. That includes, as mentioned, an anchor of World Bank financing, for example. But we want to make sure that other IFIs, other donors, they can get on the same page with the agenda, and we can think through, what they could do that is complementary to the piece that the World Bank could finance. On the private side of things, we want to make sure that if there is an opportunity, to mobilize financing from the private sector, we're looking into it. We're assessing the viability of it, and that can take extra effort. That's something that that requires detailed technical assistance that can be done by the city itself, but we can also support in that. And with the idea of being, if you can mobilize finance from say increase in land values from public investment, then that's more resources that you can devote to other priorities. As obviously financing isn't unlimited, and there will always be a wish list that that cities would like to meet. But so the more resources that are available to get there, I think the further along the line you can be in terms of reaching some of your broader resilience objectives.
Thank you. And just the last one. So you mentioned that when you're doing the city scan, you look for publicly available data sources and then utilize that. So is the analysis also available publicly? So for example, the city scan, is it available for, is it shared, or is it only for the city?
So we do, we try to produce these very quickly. The turnaround time is under 2 weeks, and as such, it's not something that we peer review and vet for publication on the World Bank side. We have produced these for our task teams and for cities, and oftentimes, you know, they'll take pieces of it and include it in reports and stuff that do get published. But the city scans themselves, they're not public as a result of that. So what we're really focused on is getting you the cities, the information that you need, you know, to have a very, very basic level understanding of some of the resilience challenges that you may face. So if you think back to, say, the urban heat map, right? That's using land surface temperature from satellites. It can give you a good sense of which parts of your city, you know, there may be, you know, more challenges with urban heat. But that's, you know, that's not something that you'd want to make, say, an investment decision on. That's something that can help start a conversation of where, for example, the heat islands may be within your city. And that's where, you know, as a program, we'll engage with you further downstream to then think through, you know, the different solutions to reduce urban heat within that space, then think through the financing options for, you know, how you can actually get that done and how it connects to a broader agenda in terms of prioritization of investment as well, to, you know, to achieve the broader objectives that you have for urban development and for ensuring a resilient future for citizens.
Thanks for that. And we have a few more questions, but we'll take it at the next round. So I think we hand over to Megha now for the next round of presentation.
Yeah, so I think as many of the questions will be perhaps addressed by Megha's presentation, because Megha is actually the senior urban economist of the World Bank, and she is actually one of the task team that has been mentioned. She is also the team lead for the competitive cities and author of the flagship report on the competitive cities for job and growth, and has a vast experience working with all sorts of cities from high middle income to fragile conflict affected countries, and also with the low income countries. So let's first hear from Megha, her direct experience of the engagement with the cities, and then we'll come back to the Q&A. Over to you, Megha.
Great. Thanks, Mai, for that lovely introduction. And thanks, Sanjay and UNDRR for having me. I'm just going to ask Jenny to please put up the slide deck that I'll be using. And while she's doing that, just a very good afternoon to everyone. I see people connected from East and South Asia, the Balkans, Latin America, Middle East, Africa, well, basically everywhere. So it's really amazing to be connected. I'm connecting from a very sunny and very summery Johannesburg here in South Africa. So it's a pleasure to participate in the seminar, and yeah, thank you again for inviting me. Next slide, please. I'm going to organize my talk in 3 parts. First, I just want to give you a sense of the challenges faced by some of the city level clients that I've been working with, and showcase how the work with the City Resilience Program has helped to provide technical solutions to some of these clients. Secondly, I wanted to demonstrate how such collaboration has led to impact on the ground. And then lastly, to give you a sneak peek on how we hope to collaborate further. Next slide, please. So until a few months ago, I actually covered West, Central, and Southern Africa for the World Bank's Urban Resilience and Land teams. I now cover work in Europe and Central Asia. The client cities and countries that I work with, they have to contend with multiple challenges. They're already struggling with scarce resources, and in some cases, they also have low capabilities. And they're increasingly being hit with multiple shocks and stressors. Often, though not always, some of these shocks and stresses are linked to climate change, a factor which is wholly outside their span of control. So what I'll do is I'll provide a couple of examples of
Megha, we lost your audio. Could you please check the audio, please? Yes, can you try again?
Is it back now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Not really sure at what point you lost me, but let me just continue. And Maya, let me know if there's another problem with my audio. I'm not quite sure what's going on. Usually if there's a thunderstorm here in Johannesburg, that interrupts my service. But as I said, it's actually a beautiful sunny day. Anyway, so what I'll just do is quickly, I'll provide a couple of examples of my city level clients in Africa and illustrate how CRPs help to provide a lot of data and technical assistance. Stephen was talking about the city scans. So we've done quite a few of those in some of my client countries. We've done them in Bamako, in Mali, in West Africa, in Conakry, in Guinea, Harare, in Zimbabwe, Bujumbura, in Burundi, and a few others. The city scans that Stephen was talking about, they're really excellent, and they serve a variety of purposes, and they serve them quite well. So first thing, they help to open up dialogue in countries and cities which are grappling with shocks and hazards, but which haven't yet begun to consider the impacts in a comprehensive way. What do I mean by that? You can think about how the different risks that cities are facing compound across places, but also across neighborhoods within cities. But this is not always clear when policymakers are looking at individual sectors or geographical or at temporal scales. So the city scans provide like layered information, which helps to illustrate how some parts of the city might be doubly or even triply affected, because they may be vulnerable to floods, but also they might be disadvantaged when it comes to measures of accessibility to socioeconomic infrastructure, to jobs, and so on. For example, in Bamako, we looked at measures of flood risk, and we combined this with information on informal dump sites and places where garbage was piling up. And then we provided a comprehensive assessment of how clogging up of drains in the city within particular neighborhoods was actually associated with much higher risks of flooding within that neighborhood, but also in downstream neighborhoods. Second, just if you move on one ahead, please, Jenny. Thanks. Actually, just move on back. I've just realized I'm moving a bit too fast then. Just go on back and I can come back to that later. Super, thank you. The second thing is that the city scans can also be a really useful supplement for country level analytics. The World Bank often carries out analysis of urban systems for the entire country. We call these urbanization reviews, and we've done many of these in several countries. So if you just Google World Bank urbanization reviews, there's a website that lists all the urbanization reviews that have been done in different countries. I've done several of these in countries where the primary city, for instance, can concentrate a large proportion of population and economic activity. But sometimes task teams like mine that are working on the ground may not have the time or the resources to carry out a separate deep dive or study for the biggest cities within a given country. And so the CRP teams help to shoulder some of that responsibility. And in each of these cases, this has resulted in a much, much richer dialogue at both the city and at the country level. And having seen the kind of analytics that our teams have provided in the capital cities, there's then increasing demand from secondary cities as well. So as an example, we're currently working in the Central African Republic, and we did a city scan for Bangui, and then an additional 3 or 4 cities in the country then also wanted their individual city scans moving forward. And third thing is that the CRP team, again, I'm just talking about the standardized evidence-based inputs. The CRP team is absolutely transparent with its use of data and information. The output and the underlying raw data is always available to the task teams and the clients in a standardized format. And this is, of course, really useful for deeper technical work. So for instance, in Bujumbura in Burundi, we combined the CRP data on incoming migrant populations to provide a very rich understanding of which parts of the city were dealing with a sudden influx of people and how they were being affected by shocks and stressors differently from the native populations in the city. And then we help to prioritize neighborhoods in terms of the needs. But more importantly, I think for our clients, the use of this data and analytics is carried out in conjunction with people on the ground. And in all of these cases, we end up building up internal capabilities to collect, to collate, and use such data, which could be done in the future with or without the collaboration of the World Bank. Okay, now you can move forward, thanks. Okay, so not only are our clients facing a whole set of new challenges with respect to resilience, a lot of our clients, or almost all of our clients, are also really, really demanding and discerning. And so in response, World Bank task teams need to be quite innovative. The CRP team is always open to risks and taking on new ideas. Some of these work out really well, but not always, as is the case with risks. So again, as an example, we were working in Bamako a couple of years ago in 2019, and we were stuck because there was really no good data on understanding where poor people were living within the city. A lot of the poverty surveys that they had was a couple of years old, and it wasn't easy to identify exactly where the poor people were living. So working with CRP, we then decided to use a combination of machine learning techniques and some ground truthing to identify what we would call slums within the city. And we wanted to standardize this approach so that it could be used for work that we were doing then, but it could also be used in the future in other countries where, for example, data on poverty is not available at that micro level in the cities. This wasn't something that anyone had really tried, certainly not in the World Bank group. And so it was something, it was a somewhat risky approach to allocate resources to pursue this further. Next slide. Of course, I mentioned this here because the approach worked really well. So this is, with a high degree of accuracy, we were actually able to map out the informal settlements or the slums for the entire metropolitan area. We picked up on small areas which were otherwise not considered by public authorities since they were not always present in large clusters. And so this is essentially a map of the data on informal settlements and slums that we created for the city of Bamako. Just to see how it informed our work, the World Bank is now in the final stages of preparing a project in Bamako, which is going to provide financing for strengthening urban resilience to floods and investing in the upgrading of community infrastructure in a lot of these vulnerable neighborhoods that we help to identify. Next slide, please. And lastly, as Stephen and Manuela mentioned, CRP also works with task teams on identifying opportunities for crowding and private finance for investments in resilient urban infrastructure. So again, in cities in West Africa, in cities in Southern Africa, we've collaborated with CRP to use geospatial data to identify, for instance, an inventory of public assets that belongs to the city or to the national government, and then look at a stream of possible investments which could be attractive to leverage private capital in those investments. Again, to come back to Bamako, where the World Bank is also providing financing along with technical assistance, my team and I work with CRP to scope out these opportunities. This involved support, for example, to help shortlist across a long list of potential investments, sending out teams on the ground to assess the financial, social, and environmental implications of the shortlist, which, for example, included a bus terminal within the city, a large market, a logistics platform. And then the project that we're working on right now, which we hope will be approved soon, has support for leveraging private capital at scale, not just for individual projects, built into the design of the project going forward. Next slide, please. So I'll spend a couple of minutes on just a few examples of where the support has had the most impact. Firstly, it has helped to grow the pipeline for financing at city level for our clients there. I mentioned the project in Bamako, which is a $250 million project. It's a city level project that was informed directly by the city scan work that we did, the slum mapping work that we did, and the support for private capital investments. More recently, based on the inputs for the city scan that we did for Bujumbura in Burundi, we're now designing an urban resilience project in that country, a project that came about really given the quality of the work and the dialogue with the subnational clients that came out of it. And now there's either financing to the tune of 150 million that's been set aside for investments there. Next, please. The machine learning techniques that I talked about earlier, they've also been incredibly useful for task teams that have been working in emergency COVID response in several countries and city clients. So for instance, in Zimbabwe and in Guinea, clients and World Bank teams were really scrambling during when the COVID crisis first hit to identify poor urban populations so that cash transfers could be provided, especially because these were people who were most affected by the strict lockdowns in these countries, given that their livelihoods were mostly in informal activities. It turns out that a lot of international development practitioners had spent a lot of time and money helping to put together social protection systems in rural areas, But in several countries, including in these 2 countries, there was really no database of the urban poor that could be identified. And so the machine learning techniques that we developed alongside CRP, supplemented with the city scan data, helped the World Bank teams to identify potential beneficiaries. And these have been instrumental in the design of projects, both bank financing projects, but also donor financing and government financing in these countries, and are being scaled up in other countries as well. Next, please. And then lastly, CRP technical inputs have informed the design of country, donor, trust fund priorities in places like Zimbabwe, and of course also influencing World Bank Group country partnership frameworks in countries like Mali and Zimbabwe, Guinea, and in other countries. World Bank Group country partnership frameworks are frameworks or strategies for the bank to work in countries for about 2 to 5 years. And so informing that is quite strategic for the countries that we end up working in. Of course, this allows teams such as mine who work on urban resilience to punch far above our weight by helping to inform a much broader development priorities, not just at city level, but for the country as a whole. I also just want to mention that the next World Bank Group corporate flagship on our Sustainable Development Group is going to be on cities and climate change. And many of these new innovations that I've just mentioned that we've tried with CRP in our client cities are now being scaled up as part of this flagship work that we're doing. So for example, coming back to the machine learning work, we're now using it at scale for countries in the Sahel and also in other parts of Africa to understand the link between shocks and migration and urban growth. And next slide, please. And lastly, to finish, as I mentioned before, I'm now working in the Europe and Central Asia unit of the bank and continuing to bring the city resilience program support for my clients here. So for instance, we've started a new study on cities and climate change in the Western Balkans, including for countries like Albania, Serbia, Bosnia, and Kosovo. The CRP team is helping us on multiple fronts. We're doing some individual city scans, for instance, in Tirana, Pristina, Sarajevo, Novi Sad and Niš in Serbia. And we're putting together a workshop to bring different cities together. We hope to have it in March, as long as travel authorizations are forthcoming. And lastly, we want to help identify, again, a possible stream of investments to strengthen resilience to climate change related shocks and stressors in our client cities. Finally, I do think it's worth mentioning for all of you that are out there connecting from different parts of the world that the CRP team brings tremendous value. Not just because of a lot of the top-notch technical inputs that they provide that is operationally relevant, but also because it's staffed with people who are very committed and they're highly responsive, and they work, really long hours and are, they're really just a fun bunch of people to work with. So I would encourage you to reach out to them, and they can connect you with task teams such as myself on the ground for work that could be done with your cities going forward. So again, thanks very much, and do let me know if you have any questions or comments.
Thank you, Megha. And Manuela and Stephen have been answering a lot of the questions by typing out the answers, but I do have a few things. Firstly, from what you are telling, it seems that capacity development of the local government is really a kind of a spin-off of this project, which may not be a direct intention, but it's there. So are there any specific measures you might be taking also to provide more capacity development, like training on the tools and so on? That's one question. And then secondly, because you're working with the local government, but I guess that you also have to coordinate with the national government before going to the local. So how does that work out? And then if cities approach the CRP directly, do they need to keep the national government in the loop?
Okay, thanks, Sanjay. So let me just give that a shot, and I would also ask Stephen and Manuela to jump in on the question of the capabilities, capacity building on the ground. So at least in the projects and the clients that I've been involved in, we normally set up sort of like informal technical working groups, which consist of mid-level technocrats working in the city government or the regional government or even the national government. In many countries, sometimes the top level management changes, or the mayor will change or the minister will change, but it's really the mid-level technocrats who are quite stable. And then their teams are the ones that end up doing a lot of the work, and we continue to work with over long periods of time. So when we work with them as part of these informal working groups, they're the ones who end up getting a lot of the capacity building on sort of like an informal basis, in the sense that, we don't really have like a training budget, but we're sitting and working with these folks. Another example, just to mention, and then I would ask, I saw Stephen just put his camera on, maybe he can jump in and talk a little bit more about formalized ways of capacity building and training. But another thing to mention is that we often reach out and work with universities on the ground to help us collect some of the information and help us with the ground truthing of the data. And these are young people who are super smart, work really well with smartphones. And it so happens that a lot of these people who work with us and end up going and working in their local governments anyway. And so that's also been like a really fulfilling way of seeing capacity grow on the ground. Let me just quickly answer the question on the national local level coordination, and then maybe turn over to Stephen and Manuela. On the coordinations of the World Bank group, just to be clear, if we do financing, that is with the national government. However, all of our other activities, which could be technical assistance or analytical work, can be at different levels of government as well. So for example, we often work with the city level governments as long as it is something that's been identified as of strategic importance for the World Bank group, and there's demand on the client side to showcase that this is where the bank needs to really come in and add value. However, if we then want to convert or deepen that dialogue and go from technical assistance work to, say, financing, for example, like in Bamako, as I mentioned, or in Bujumbura, in Burundi, at that case, it's really important to make sure that the ministries of finance or the treasuries and the main sort of ministries are involved, because there needs to be really clear coordination between what it is that the city needs to get done and what borrowing is being taken at the country level for financing. Thank you.
Thanks, Megha. And Stephen and Manuela, you want to add anything?
So I think Megha answered it well, and as mentioned before, our work is done through the task teams. So the examples that Megha gave there, that's exactly how we see our impact on the ground. So we want to make sure that our support involves local communities. As Megha mentioned, we often work with university students. We want to make sure that the most vulnerable within communities as well are engaged in the decision-making process. And oftentimes what we try to pull out of our information is, who is being most affected by some of the resilience challenges that cities are facing. So it's a big part of our process is to engage communities, to understand, what the challenges are, and then to work with city officials on building capacity in this space, as Megha so illustrated. So on that piece, I think definitely in accordance with what was said earlier. On the national level piece as well, at the World Bank, we're any sort of lending program that we have requires a sovereign guarantee. So we need to be coordinating with the national level for any sort of cities program. And there were some questions as well in the chat around smaller cities, secondary cities, and I answered it in the chat. But we often end up supporting secondary cities, usually in a way where a World Bank program would cover multiple cities. But that allows us, it gives us a chance to work with some of these smaller cities in that individual way, which oftentimes, those are the cities that have the lowest capacity, that need the most help in this space. So don't feel, scared to reach out because you're not a mega city either. At the World Bank, we very much understand that, to support sustainable development, we do really need to focus outside of, just where the fancy airports are that you fly into. So.
Okay, so I think we're just on time, but just one last quick one. How do all the players prioritize which area they want to focus on? Because there are so many issues on resilience in a city. So is it that it comes out from the profiling, the gaps or the weak areas, and then that is prioritized, or is it some other way?
This is a complicated question, but I think, personally, I think that cities already have investment priorities. They have a decent sense of, what are the 2, 3, 4 key projects that they need to get done that will have the greatest development impact. So what we're not trying to do is really, reinvent the wheel, think through prioritization, in a completely different way. What we want to do is make sure that, when cities are making those decisions, they're thinking about it from a perspective of what will my city look like in 2050? How will urban growth affect the profile of the service delivery that we need to provide? How do natural hazards, for example, fit into the picture here? Are we really considering this when we're, say flood risk, when we're thinking through our core investments? And then, how does that impact our prioritization process? How can we look at the projects that we already have prioritized and integrate these into our detailed design? So the quicker we catch that upstream, I think the more impact that we can have. Some of these are very simple, where you find something, you flag it, you realize you're going to build a bus depot in a flood zone, and you move the bus depot. Others are a bit more complicated by thinking, okay, we've identified these challenges. We want to incorporate them into our prioritization, but this is also increasing the budget that's required from our side, the financing that's required to get things done. Can you help us on that aspect as well? So we want to pair the two pieces together, and I think that's really at the core of our program and what we're trying to do. So thank you.
Thanks for that, because there is a tool under the MCR 2030 also called the Disaster Resilience Scorecard for cities, which helps cities identify gaps. And maybe this is something which can be explored further. One feeds to the other. So anyway, that's for the future. So I think we are on time now. So I hand over to Mai, and thank you all three of you for your participation and all the information you shared. Mai.
Thank you, Sanjaya, and thank you all the speakers. I think we have a very clear insight on what CRP is providing to the cities, and we'll look forward to sharing more of any upcoming information that you may have from the CRP, the case studies, or any lesson learned from the cities that could be benefiting any other cities and those who are interested. And for the audience, all of the presentations and the recording for today's session we'll be sharing at the website that has been posted in the chat. And we'll also be sending a follow-up emails to your email address to remind, to again double sharing this web link. And also we'll be sending out the survey questions and if you can provide the feedback on how you feel about the webinars today, it will really help us greatly in improving the subsequent webinar we'll be organizing. So with that said, thank you so much again for all of the speakers, also with our 2 interpreters and all the people behind the scene who helped to support the organization of this webinar. And we look forward for the next series of the MCR 2030 series webinar in the coming months. Thank you so much and have a good night, good day, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thanks to you and Danielle for the organization and all the logistics behind it. It was really very well organized. Thanks a lot. And thanks for hosting us.
Thanks for having me. Have a good afternoon, good evening on your end. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.